Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the last Human Rights in Practice series event of the semester entitled Protecting Asylum-Seeking Women and Children Under Trump, co-sponsored by the International Human Rights Clinic here and the Center for International and Comparative Law. I'm very, very happy to introduce our speaker for today, Blaine Bookey, who is co-legal director at the UC Hastings-based Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, where she's been since 2011. And at the center, Blaine has had her hand in all program areas, including impact litigation, expert consultation and training, research and analysis, and international human rights. Before joining the center, Blaine served as a federal appellate law clerk and a legal fellow at a public interest law firm in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. She also chairs the board of the International Women's Rights Organization, MADRE. The American Constitution Society recognized Blaine for her work on behalf of marginalized communities with the 2016 David Carliner Public Interest Award. And Blaine received her JD from Hastings, an undergraduate degree in social policy and gender studies from Northwestern University. And today, Blaine will discuss efforts nationally to protect women and children in an ever-increasingly hostile environment for asylum seekers in the United States. She'll cover recent migration trends of women and children and the conditions that they're fleeing, as well as the legal and procedural barriers to protection at each stage for those seeking safe haven in the United States. And finally, she'll be highlighting the advocacy and litigation that the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies and other partners have been doing to ensure that the U.S. lives up to its domestic and international obligations to the persecuted. And finally, I wanted to thank all of our co-sponsors for the event today. So we have quite a range, including the Coalition Against Gendered Violence, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, Duke Human Rights Center at the Keenan Institute for Ethics, the Human Rights Law Society, the Immigrant and Refugee Project, the International Law Society, and the Women Law Students Association. So great interest from many different sectors of Duke today. So I'm very happy to turn it over to Blaine, who'll speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aya, and all of you for coming to this event and not the Paul Manafort indictments event. I know this will be far less salacious, but hopefully interesting nonetheless to all of you. When I clerked on the Third Circuit, one of my co-clerks, who's now one of my closest friends, he and this whole group of friends, they all went to Duke and always told me how great Duke was and that, you know, it was way better than Hastings and everything. So far, so good. So, but beautiful campus, and so it's really nice to be here. So I'm just curious first, so who has worked on an asylum case or a refugee case or taken an asylum or refugee law course or something that's touched on it? Got two-ish? Okay. All right, and who has some interest in it, considering it? Okay, more. Okay, I'm gonna see how many at the end. I'll come back to this. Okay, multiple things here. So here's what I want to cover today. So first, how does our organization, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, work on issues of violence against women and girls? Why are women and girls and children from Mexico and Central America fleeing to the United States in greater numbers than ever? And should these women and children be granted protection under U.S. law for the harms that they have suffered and fear in Mexico and Central America? And what are the challenges that they're facing to seeking protection here in the United States? And finally, what is our organization and other collaborators doing to overcome some of these challenges and the particular attacks on asylum seekers that we're seeing by the Trump administration? So our organization, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, envisions a world where no one is subject to persecution based on their identity or fundamental beliefs. Through our various program areas, we strive to protect the fundamental rights of refugees and asylum seekers. So big vision, but our organization was founded following the victory in a case known as Matter of Kasinga. It was the first case out of the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the administrative appellate body, sort of known as the highest immigration tribunal here in the United States, that granted asylum to a woman who was fleeing female genital cutting from Togo. And it was the first time that the board had recognized that a woman who was fleeing harms that were inflicted on her because of her gender, and that women could be in a particular group and deserve this protection in the United States. So that was a big victory in '96. And our director litigated that case and then the next day, pretty much, she was getting calls all around the country saying, I have a case like yours, can you help me? I have a case of someone fleeing domestic violence, someone fleeing trafficking, fleeing a range of other harms inflicted against women because they're women. Sexual violence, sort of a range of cases. And she said, I can't help all these people on my own. So she founded the center at Hastings in '99. And so that was really the core of our founding, was helping attorneys to represent women fleeing similar types of harms, helping them get the resources to make a difference in individual cases, but then at the same time really advancing the law and pushing it forward. So we have this great victory in Kasinga. How can we open the doors to more women fleeing these sorts of harms? And I'll talk kind of more about that later, and what happened after Kasinga and kind of where we are now. Our work now has really grown to encompass all sorts of asylum claims, so not just gender claims, but we're really known as experts on asylum law in the U.S. and especially novel claims. So a lot of the women and children that are fleeing Central America and Mexico these days are fleeing gang-related violence and cartel and other organized criminal groups. And those claims raise other kind of novel legal theories. So we are trying to push now to break open the law to show that these individuals fleeing gang violence also merit asylum under U.S. laws. So our new tagline, which I'm testing out, which I just came up with the other day, is good lawyers and good law. So that's what we do. Good lawyers and good law. We help lawyers and we help make better laws. See, I'm gauging the reaction. Okay, I'm not sure it's going to work, but okay. So as I mentioned, the core of our work is providing free expert consultation to attorneys who are litigating asylum cases. And the couple of you who've worked on asylum or taken a course in asylum know this incredibly complex area of the law, on top of the fact that you're working with traumatized clients, many of whom don't speak English or understand the U.S. legal system. So by providing this technical assistance to the attorneys, we're really able to track what's happening in these cases nationally. So we're seeing cases in every single immigration court in the United States, and from really a range of cases, every single country, every single type of case. And then what happens is through these cases, we can identify, okay, what are the cases that might be a good vehicle for strategic impact litigation in the courts of appeals? What are the areas of the law that need policy to address some of the issues that people are facing? And our program, since the surge of women and kids the last few years, and raise your hand if you've heard of this so-called surge of women and children from Central America. Most people. So and a few years ago, about 2014, we saw 60,000 kids come across the border by themselves, so unaccompanied kids, and even more family units, mostly women with their children fleeing violence. So kind of corresponding with that surge, we have seen a surge in the request for our assistance because women and kids from Central America is one of our primary areas of expertise. So when I started in about 2011 at this organization, we were getting about 500 requests a year. Now we're getting more than 500 requests a month. So you can kind of see, these are the new requests that we're getting. So we're seeing a lot of the cases that are being litigated in the courts here are somehow passing through our center, and we're trying to identify trends and what's happening to sort of like a feedback loop to give back better assistance to help people win their cases. And I looked in our database, and over 130 or so from the last few years are from Charlotte Immigration Court. And where are the asylum seekers coming from? So the vast majority, as I said, are coming from the Northern Triangle countries in Central America of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and Mexico making up more than 80% of the cases. And then we have a sort of a smattering of cases from other, and this is just from September, but it really reflects kind of what has been the breakdown in the cases that we've been seeing over the last 3 to 4 years. So why are women and children from Central America leaving their homes, going on an incredibly perilous journey through Central America, all of Mexico in many cases, and then finding their way to the U.S. border, oftentimes being separated from their children or other family, and heading to a place where a lot of them know that they're probably going to be detained now. So what is driving people, what is driving migration flows in the region now? There's been a couple of studies by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, over the last few years that are, they have some nice graphics, so I've used them, but they really are just reflective of a series of studies that have come out. We've conducted a couple of studies with, transnational study with scholars in Mexico and Central America. Many other organizations have done the same, and they really are all coming out with the same finding, which is that violence is the key driver of migration in the region. Women and kids would rather escape to an unknown fate here in the United States than stay in their home country and face what they know is certain death. So as you can see here, many of the women reported that their persecutors, and the reason why they were fleeing is that the people harming them were gang members or intimate partners. And in many of those cases, it was intersecting. So their intimate partner is also a gang member, and that being in a gang gives them more power and ability to have control and harm the woman. And the harms that they're fleeing are physical violence, sexual violence, and death threats. So children, the UNHCR study for children the year before the study, or 2 years before the study on women, it interviewed Central American and Mexican children, finding that a very significant percentage of the children were also leaving home because of violence. Oops. Oops. This all okay. Yeah, we're leaving because of violence in their homes and at the society at large. So this was a really kind of, I think, shocking study for a lot of people, because it was a totally different finding from an earlier study that UNHCR had put out in 2006. So this is 2014, and in 2006, a study had showed that they had done a similar study of interviewing kids, and only about 13% of the kids that were interviewed had what they call international protection concerns. So kids who might need protection in another place other than their home country. So that goes from, around 13% to now close to 60% of these kids are leaving for reasons of violence or physical safety, and that includes violence also in their homes. So a lot of the kids were living in sort of destabilized family structures when parents had migrated during earlier periods, and then kids are left behind with other family members and incredibly vulnerable to violence in their home and nowhere to go. So the rate of gender-motivated killings in the region, I think, really underscores how dire the circumstances are. This is really just the most extreme form of violence, and you can see these are 3 incredibly small countries, and none of them are at war, and they have some of the highest rates of killings of women and homicide rates generally, which is on the next slide, in the world. So by a point of comparison, the United States rate of killing of women is 1.8, and Canada, the UK, and Japan are all under 1 per 100,000 inhabitants. So this is incredibly high number among a very small population. So you can imagine that the sort of what that does to people and their belief that their lives are in danger, and really knowing that their lives are in danger, which sort of is pushing them to come here to seek protection. And this is the homicide rates, which show also all 3 countries among the highest homicide rates in the world. This is including countries that are at war. And many of the victims of these killings are also children. I don't know why it keeps... Sorry for the tickling. That's okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the growth of gangs in Central America, and gangs kind of imply street gangs, so just a loose affiliation of a few people. These are, really have grown into much more sophisticated, organized criminal groups that are basically de facto governments in the places where they operate in Central America. The 2 most well-known, that's really started in the United States and then were sort of transposed back to Central America with a sort of wave of deportations of Salvadorans first from the United States. So we, had our hand in the current violent situation that exists in Central America. So the 2, I think maybe there's it's like an automatic slideshow or something. But anyway, we can always just turn it off. But for those who need visuals, So the 2 most well-known criminal groups are the Barrio 18, or DA18, and Mara Salvatrucha, the MS-13, and they've really had a huge impact on safety and violence in the region, and also in Mexico. And the types of violence that kids are facing is forced recruitment. So the age has continued to go down, as a lot of these countries have actually perversely enacted laws to protect kids. It means that kids under a certain age are no longer criminally liable for certain activities, so the gangs actually preying on those kids to carry out some of the illegal illegal activity of the gang because they know that they won't be held criminally liable for it. And then there's just extreme retaliation against the kid as well as the family for refusing to join the gang. They're extorting families and then killing or harming them if they don't meet the extortion demands. There's high rates of sexual violence and domestic violence, and all kids and women and young girls in particular are incredibly vulnerable to this violence, and including trying to escape the gang, they then become vulnerable to drug traffickers or others. So the situation, just to paint a picture, is just incredibly dire of what people are facing in the region. So our database, this is back to the CGRS database again, it just shows that the types of cases that we're seeing at our center completely reflect exactly what's happening in the home countries. So the vast majority of the cases where we're receiving requests for our assistance involve some type of gang violence. A lot of these cases are, they might have multiple forms of persecution. So the case might be partner abuse, but also gang-related violence. So it's not sort of one by one per case, but. So the question, kind of knowing all of that, is can and should women and children who are fleeing this kind of violence qualify for protection under U.S. law? So for those of you who are just lay people who don't know a lot about asylum law here in the United States, just knowing what you know now about violence and what's driving people to come here, do you think people should be protected under U.S. law somehow? Is there anyone that thinks no? There's some form of protection available. What isn't reflected on these slides is that there is essentially no functioning state in any of these countries to actually provide any modicum of protection for people. So everyone is on board that there's probably some kind of protection for most people. Okay. Well, you're right. There are 3 forms of interrelated types of protection under U.S. law. So just a kind of quick background, a lot of people confuse sort of asylum seekers with refugees, and refugees have been in the news a lot because of the Muslim ban 1, 2, and 3 from the United States, so sort of keeping refugees out. It's a different system. So the asylum system is people who are here, either at a U.S. port of entry, knocking on our door, or somebody who's found in the United States. As refugees are people who apply for refugee status from abroad, usually from a refugee camp or from a third country outside of their country of persecution. But they both have to meet the same definition to show that they fear persecution in their country on account of one of these 5 protected reasons. But the where they apply and how they apply is very different. So asylum seekers make up a much smaller percentage, it's only about around 40,000 or so asylum applications a year, and refugee applications now have been slashed to 45,000 admissions a year by the Trump administration. But before that, it was 100-some thousand. But there's no quota for asylum seekers. If you're here and you fear returning to your home country, you can seek asylum. So, and that's the system that we work in. So I don't do refugee work outside of the United States, just here in the United States, or with other countries that are trying to set up asylum systems similar to the U.S. But there's a couple of other forms of relief other than asylum. So asylum is for people who can establish they are a refugee, that they have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, and that their government won't protect them. And then withholding of removal and Convention Against Torture relief are 2 other kinds of protections where the United States has said under international law that's now been implemented into U.S. law that we won't send people back to countries where they fear persecution or torture. That's sort of what we as a country have said as a global community, that countries will protect people from persecution or torture. Withholding is it's a statutory creature, and it has a weird long history, which I won't get into, but essentially it's people who don't qualify for asylum. So we have a 1-year filing deadline for asylum in the U.S. So if you don't file within 1 year and you can't meet one of the exceptions, then withholding is this other kind of protection that's available to you. But it doesn't have as many benefits. So asylum, you can get a green card after having asylum. You can bring your spouse and children to the United States. It leads to a lot of protections here, whereas withholding doesn't. And Convention Against Torture protection is similar in that it protects people. It keeps you here in the United States. We won't send you back, but it's not as protective. It doesn't lead to permanent status. It doesn't allow you to petition for your family, but it does protect you from being returned to torture. So this is, for those who are interested in a little bit more detail, and I can share these slides with you, but as you can see, so basically each of these 3 forms of protection in the U.S. requires that there be some quantum of harm, so that they either have suffered a harm in the past or they'll suffer a harm in the future that equals persecution or that equals torture. Each of them requires that there be some sort of likelihood. So for asylum, it's a 1 in 10 chance that this would happen to you if you went back. Withholding and CAT relief, it's that it's more likely than not. So, some courts have interpreted that to mean, 51%, more like a preponderance of the evidence standard. And they all require some element that the government, your home government, is either the person who's inflicting the harm on you or is not able or willing to protect you from that harm. And then just if you show that you're eligible for the harm, asylum is discretionary, but withholding and CAT are mandatory. So if you meet all those requirements, then you're automatically granted the relief. So I think the long and the short of it is that they're very complex forms of relief. Each one of them has, you have to establish many legal elements in order to be granted the form of relief, and each one of those individual elements is usually a multi-part test. Our U.S. statute also applies a very, very onerous corroboration standard. So many people flee with nothing more than the shirt on their backs, and they come here and then they're expected to produce, pretty significant evidence to support their claims. So it's just to impress sort of how difficult it is for people to actually establish that they are eligible for asylum. So you all said that you think that women who are fleeing gender-based harms or kids fleeing gang violence should in some way be protected under one of these forms of relief. But historically, there's actually been significant barriers to recognizing these sorts of protection. How can they fit within these weird legal frameworks? And so it's been kind of an ongoing battle in the courts in the United States and in Congress and with the rest of the executive branch. There's been a lot of resistance, and so kind of what are the main reasons why there's been a sort of a challenge to these cases? So the first is that the harms that women are facing, domestic violence, other types of harms, sexual violence, that it's isn't that just a cultural norm or a religious dictate? Is this really persecution? Are we being sort of cultural imperialists by saying that these types of harms that we don't think, that we think they're a human rights violation, but if another country thinks that they're, acceptable, is that really persecution? The next is that the state is often not the persecutor in women's claims and kids' claims now. So it's often not the government actors that are inflicting the persecution. It's often family members, other community members, gang members, and don't these countries have laws in place to protect people in these groups? Each of the Central American countries has what's basically a Violence Against Women Act. Each of them has essentially a children's code that are all meant to protect women and kids from these types of harms, even though they're incredibly ineffective and not applied. But they have them, right? So should they really get asylum here? The other is that persecution needs to be on account of one of those protected, some sort of protected class. And that list I mentioned of race, religion, nationality, et cetera, doesn't list gender. It doesn't list children. So could the treaty drafters of the Refugee Convention really have had it in mind that women and kids, should be granted based on their status as a woman or a child? And that depends on your interpretation, how you interpret treaties. But the particular social group ground really was meant as kind of meant to be sort of to allow the law to expand, sort of to evolve as our international human rights standards evolve, sort of how our thinking of these issues evolves. And then lastly, floodgates fears. So you hear this a lot when there's discussions now about immigrants and asylum seekers recognizing people for protection here, that if we allow in one woman, that's 50% of the world's population, is every single woman then now going to come to the United States and obtain asylum protection? We know that this is not actually true. This is, we've been recognizing these kinds of claims for years, and we haven't seen sort of a mass exodus. As I showed earlier, there's so many things you have to prove. So not even if you got here, not everybody would actually be able to prove that they're eligible. And also, it's just really size has never been a requirement. As I mentioned earlier, asylum has never had a quota system. So we've never we set up our current asylum system following World War II, when the global community kind of came together and said, never again are we allowing 6 million people to perish because of their fundamental beliefs. So we have all said that no matter the number, that all human lives are deserving of equal protection. So okay, it's a lot of challenges. But despite these challenges, we have seen pretty significant advances in the law, and really the evolution of the jurisprudence has been pretty consistent. You know, there's a couple of outlier circuits, but for the most part, we've seen just kind of a consistent recognizing of claims. So it starts with the case I mentioned earlier, female genital cutting of a woman being granted asylum. It's kind of moved. We now have various other cases that are recognizing other forms of gender-based harms, recognizing women as a particular social group in many different cases. So we've seen kind of pretty consistent recognition of these cases as deserving of protection. Doesn't mean, as I mentioned, that every single person who's fleeing this kind of harm merits protection, but it just that their claims can be recognized. Okay, but not so. Every good story has, kind of some sort of a climax. But so the domestic violence cases have really faced a completely kind of different track. So as that previous slide showed, you had from 96 onward, you kind of have this, pretty consistent, somewhat meandering line of jurisprudence that just really develops over the years. Whereas domestic violence cases, basically there was a full stop. So after the Kasinga case in 96, in 99, there was a case of a woman named Rodi Alvarado, and she was fleeing extreme domestic violence from her partner in Guatemala, over 10 years of just really horrific violence. And she was actually granted by an immigration judge in San Francisco, and the government appealed the grant of her case to the Board of Immigration Appeals, and the Board of Immigration Appeals sustained the government's appeal, said, yes, she's not eligible for asylum, completely walked back from all the rationale that it had espoused just a couple years earlier in Kasinga, and basically said women aren't a member of a social group in this case, her persecution is not on account of, it's just personal violence in the home, and that she was not deserving of protection in the United States. So that was in 99, just a couple years after Kasinga. So there was huge outcry among the women's rights movement in the United States, immigrants' rights movement, just very, very strong reaction to that decision. And so it was actually, the Attorney General retracted it. So that decision no longer was good law. And the Attorney General basically said, okay, let's issue regulations that just give some uniformity to the law. And they proposed regulations in 2000, and they have still never been finalized. So that's, 17 years of not finalizing these regulations. But during that whole period of time, or a big chunk of that time, the Attorney General basically said, okay, Rodi Alvarado's case can't move forward. None of the domestic violence cases can move forward. We're going to keep them all on hold at the board until regulations are issued. So it went through like 3 different attorneys generals, a couple of different presidents, and then finally the Attorney General said, okay, you can go ahead and issue a decision in Rodi's case. But it just sent it back to the immigration court with no precedential opinion. And it still continued to hold all the domestic violence cases. So that's why the previous slide of the sort of development in jurisprudence, there's nothing on domestic violence or intimate partner violence, because all those cases, hundreds of them, are being held at the board for 15 years. Till finally, matter of ARCG came down in 2014, basically saying that a Guatemalan woman, very similar circumstances to Rodi Alvarado, merited asylum in the United States. She was a member of a social group of women in domestic relationships or married women in Guatemala, and that those women, just fundamentally the principle established by the case is that yes, women fleeing domestic violence are eligible for asylum in the United States. So this is a huge victory in 2014. It's definitely under threat right now. There have been, in individual cases, the government's making crazy arguments that trying to distinguish ARCG. We've heard sort of threats that it's, could be possibly certified to the Attorney General again. So it was a hard-fought victory, and we're doing everything we can to keep it. But just know that there have been a lot of challenges. So at the same time, there have also been, pretty significant resistance to the gang claims. So kids fleeing forced recruitment to the gangs, or fleeing extortion, or other forms of harm by the gang. The Fourth Circuit, so people who are going to stay here and maybe do kind of litigation in this circuit, has been a lot better on these cases. So has kind of been a leader in recognizing different types of cases. So people who are witnesses or informants against the gang, they're considered a group, and people who are eligible. They've even recognized some extortion claims, religious-based claims. So there has been some advancement, but this is kind of for us really the next frontier. So we, spent 15 years litigating domestic violence cases, and now are really kind of doubling down on spending, maybe probably the next 15 years litigating gang cases. Okay. So there has been, as I mentioned, some recognition that children or childhood youth can be some basis of a social group. Recognizing that when kids are being targeted because they're kids, because of their vulnerable position in society, that children, as a group, should be eligible for some form of protection. A lot of these cases were not in the gang context, so you can kind of see how the judges do kind of mental acrobats in their mind, acrobatics in their mind, to basically not analogize to, people who are studying the law, it doesn't matter what area, usually, you have you look to analogous case law to extend the law, whereas in the asylum context, they look at analogous case law and essentially like bury it, under saying we don't even really need to look at this, we'll just, it's completely illogical and unreasoned, and actually just really results oriented, so they're looking for a way to deny and they find a way to deny. But we have all this great case law, so there's some foundation there for us. So how is the Trump administration seeking to deny protections to asylum seekers? So the Obama administration, just to be frank, really wasn't the best friend to immigrants in the United States, really adopted lots of policies of deterrence against women and children that were coming here in these greater numbers, started locking them up in family detention centers, a policy that had been abandoned previously, started militarizing Mexico's southern border to keep people from even getting here. So a lot of these, really what Obama did is kind of set up the architecture that just has allowed the current administration to just kind of have all of the architecture on steroids, essentially. So when I said how is Trump seeking to deny protection to asylum seekers, it's basically every single possible way. So asylum seekers have really been they've been really a direct target under attack. So Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General, gave a speech a couple of weeks ago basically saying that all asylum seekers are liars and frauds, saying that all of their lawyers are dirty immigration lawyers. And we proudly now wear the badge of dirty immigration lawyer, if that's what if that's what it takes. A few months before that, you have the highest official within ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who's sort of our highest law enforcement officer in the immigration field, saying that immigrants and asylum seekers should be watching their back, trying to stoke serious fear in the community. So they're really in sort of at ground zero for this administration, even though, as I mentioned, it's usually an incredibly vulnerable, sympathetic group of people, but just kind of to shift that narrative to say that they're all liars, and that they're the people who are infiltrating and committing terrorist attacks and the like. So the first is that they're limiting access to the asylum system. So as I mentioned, in every possible way. So I'll kind of walk you through the 3 steps of where they're stopping people. So the first is they're actually limiting access to the U.S. territory at all. Because as I mentioned earlier, to get asylum, you have to be here at a port of entry or in the United States. So the first is they're stopping them even from getting to the U.S. territory. So they're south of the U.S. border, basically stopping people, by propping up the Mexican law enforcement or putting money into Guatemala's southern border, just keeping people from getting here at all, and doing sort of campaigns of deterrence in the home country, saying don't make the journey to the United States, you won't find protection. People still do it anyway because their lives are at risk, and they get to the border, and then Border Patrol agents say to them, "No more asylum for you." So they actually they present themselves at a port of entry, and the Border Patrol literally says no asylum. People have this on tape. So some lawyers sued, saying that there's a right, under international and U.S. law to seek asylum. And by all accounts, at least some of the Border Patrol stations, they have stopped doing that. But there's still some accounts that are coming out of other Border Patrol really sort of empowered. So let's just say somebody actually makes it through. So now they have to limit it in another way. So they limit, so once you get here, so you limit access to the territory, and then they limit your access to the actual asylum system itself. So you might get through a port of entry, or you might come in undetected, but then if you're found, you're thrown into a detention center, somewhere in a far-flung place where you have limited access to an attorney, and where the conditions are so bad that you want to give up your claim because you can't bear to spend another day in detention. So a lot of people don't actually ever access the asylum system. Okay, then let's just say somebody actually makes it there. I should just say Trump recently asked for 10,000 more beds. So there's about 40,000 beds detention space, and they're upping that to 50,000. A huge percentage of those people are asylum seekers. Other countries do not detain asylum seekers in jails, just to let you know, sort of as comparison. There might be places where they go, but they're more of like a halfway house, sort of a place to be while you're sort of collecting yourself and applying. We are unique in that regard. So let's just say they actually do get in, they maybe find a lawyer, they make it to court. Then they're trying to roll back the advances in the law, which I talked about earlier, sort of this long trajectory of sort of, chipping away at recognizing women's claims or chipping away at recognizing fear of gang claims as actually valid claims. They're taking very extreme positions in litigation and also working with Congress to put in some bills that essentially sort of categorically deny any person fleeing gang violence from receiving protection in the United States. So they're trying to find ways to really sort of at every single step stop people from being able to find protection here. And in some places, they don't need anybody else to do this for them because there's these horrible judges all over the country and in some particular jurisdictions that we have termed asylum-free zones. So where you have judges that are denying 90+% of the cases that they're seeing, and in some cases, 98% of the cases that they're seeing. And having seen a lot of the cases that are actually going before these judges, it's not that they're seeing, all of the fraud cases or they're seeing all of the cases that don't qualify under the law. They're seeing the same cases that are being granted in other courts. So that's kind of when you think of a system of rule of law, you really think that cases that raise similar factual scenarios will receive similar treatment, and that is absolutely not what we're seeing. So Charlotte is one of these, quote, asylum-free zones, and it's not the worst. But it's pretty bad. So you have, there's 3 judges here. So I just pulled, this is the latest data that came out. There's the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse at Syracuse, TRAC, and they're kind of the go-to place for all of the data on immigration judges. So as you can see here, you have some judges who've had, just a pretty abysmal rate. But on top of that, it's the sort of how they treat asylum seekers before them in their courts is in a very hostile way. So we brought a case, or we had a thematic hearing at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on this issue last year, and we're still waiting for sort of next steps on that. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has filed several complaints with the agency, and there's been a lot of reports. And then kind of the next step is really just pushing these cases on an individual basis, sort of documenting them as well as we can, and then appealing them until we put enough pressure on the judges to either get them out of their positions or to get them to have some shame or change their minds. But the disparities in adjudication have been really long recognized. There's been a lot of studies on disparities. So you have San Francisco court, you have an 80-some% grant rate. And then you've got the Charlotte court, 80-some% denial rate. So there's obviously something really out of whack. The national average is around 50-some%. So it's, there's obviously something going on, and the government has been on notice for this for many, many years, more than a decade, and taken no remedial action at all to improve these, massive disparities that we're seeing in the courts. So how are we responding at CJRS to all of what seems like an all-out attack on asylum seekers? I was telling Aya that before I came here, I just looked at the news because I thought maybe something else had happened, in the last day since I've checked the news, because that's how it feels right now. Just kind of every morning, okay, what's next? What are we fighting against now? And so our, kind of first and foremost, we're really just trying to stand our ground. So we have made these advances in the law and in the treatment of asylum seekers in some places. So how can we just do everything we can to really stop ourselves from sliding back over the next couple of years? And just really finding ways to ensure access to the asylum system. So working with attorneys in Tijuana to prep clients before they come to the border to know to really assert their rights. Once people are in the United States, really trying to push for an end to the detention. So we recently filed suit against the government for withholding data on detention of asylum seekers, because asylum seekers who come to the port of entry, they should be released if they're not a danger to the community or they're not a flight risk, meaning that they'll show up to their hearing. But they're not releasing them, and the government's not releasing data to us. So we can't even hold them accountable to what the policy is. So we recently sued to get that data. we're trying to expand the quality and availability of legal representation. So I'm not sure how many of you know this, but in the immigration context, there's no right to a government-funded counsel. So in the criminal context, we have a public defender system. So no criminal defendant goes at it alone in court if they're indigent. Whereas in immigration court, even though the consequences, it's civil cases, but the consequences are more criminal in nature, and the end result is deportation. If you lose your case, and in many instances that results in someone being returned to a place where they fear harm. So you'd think that we would have some sort of system for this, but we don't. Even for vulnerable groups, so even for kids, there's no right to counsel, no right to government-funded counsel for children. So you have unaccompanied children going at it alone in court in some places. So what we've been really focusing on are state and local efforts to push for universal representation. So the state of California last year actually just approved $40 million, and it's being dispersed now for legal representation in immigration courts. So we're doing everything we can to set up and show the benefits of what's basically a public defender system for immigrants in immigration court, to sort of expand that model. So New York was one of the first, and then you have some other places that are slowly getting on board, recognizing that this is a serious due process issue. And then, as I mentioned earlier, sort of litigating as many cases as we can in the courts to try to hold on to the case law gains that we've made by getting more of them. So I guess that's all I really have. So there's at least some time. So if any of you end up working on asylum cases in clinics or in practice, please do stay in touch with us. We provide all of our services free of charge. So we do one-on-one phone consultations. We do research in country and work with experts to document what's going on in country that then can be submitted as evidence in your cases. We have sample briefs, all that sort of stuff. And we also are currently hiring for summer law clerks. So if anybody is interested, we have a great opportunity for law students to get involved. So yeah, and then you can join our mailing list. So, but thank you. Yeah, I think there's still 15 minutes. Yeah. Great. So, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. It was very interesting. I had two questions, if that's okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So the first one is that you mentioned that you're looking for alternatives for detention centers for asylum seekers, and I'm curious what the alternatives would be. I'm researching this in the context of Mexico, and what we've been seeing is that women that are in like informal or shelters on the border actually run more risk of vulnerability when they're not being detained, because they can be trafficked or they will seek informal employment opportunities. So I'm curious what the alternatives would be for the U.S. I also don't think detention is a good form. But I'm just curious what they would be. And then the second one is, have you had cases of female gang members? Because I think a lot of women are coerced into joining gangs, or their initiation processes are very brutally sexual, and so they do qualify, but because they have the stigma or the label of being a gang member, I don't know if that complicates their ability to access asylum. So
Yeah, no, good questions. So the alternatives to detention, that's actually a term in the U.S. So there are these like alternatives to detention, and that basically means ankle shackles. So that's essentially what the United States has developed as an alternative. They call them ankle monitors, but they are not a monitor. They're these huge things that are, strapped to their leg. People have, their pain. They basically have to charge them every few hours. It's like, so that's been kind of what the U.S. has developed as our alternative. But the real alternative is release to family members or others. So most people who come have somebody that they can go to. So in the cases, in the pre-Trump world, or even pre-Obama, when people were being what's known as paroled in, so they would get out, they had somewhere to go. So there isn't, not high rates that I know of asylum seekers living on the streets. So there's usually a community that people are coming to. So I think that's the true alternative, is release. That's a good question about what countries are doing this really well. I think there are some in Western Europe, that actually have. They're not like a shelter at the border. They're a nice actual place where there's employment sort of wraparound social services and things like that. I think would be even better. So if you don't have anybody to go to, then we have this kind of as anybody seen *Handmaid's Tale*, I'm thinking of like when she goes to Canada and there's this like social services center that so something like that. But I'm curious to see your research when you're done, because I haven't looked into this issue a lot. And then former gang members, or sort of, quote gang member cases of people who've been involved in the gang, there's been some circuits that have basically said, so if you're being targeted for being a former gang member, sort of you somehow got initiated to the gang even as a kid, and then you're trying to get out, and now you're being attacked precisely because you have now shunned the gang. There's been a couple of circuits that have recognized former gang members as a social group, and then some other circuits that have said essentially no. So it kind of depends on where you end up. For now, that case is pending. There's a cert pending at the Supreme Court on that actual issue. But I think the bigger issue that kind of comes up in the cases is whether they've engaged in persecution themselves, because a bar to asylum is a persecutor of others. Yeah, so if you've, and that is actually currently pending at the Board of Immigration Appeals, whether there's a duress exception to the persecutor of others bar. So I think essentially, like a lot of questions in law, it depends, and it depends on what happens in the next 6 months to a year, I guess, of what the state of the law is in the United States. But I do think that people who've been coerced into a gang, in my personal view of the law, should not be barred from seeking asylum, especially when they're leaving, in particular to leave the gang. So what kind of message, if we're thinking about the sort of political implications of it, what sort of message does it send to not provide protection to these people, rather than sort of basically sending them back. So yeah, it does complicate the issue, but in my personal view, if the law moves in the way that I hope that it moves, then it could actually be the basis of asylum itself. So being forced to commit harm on somebody else should be considered persecution of somebody, in my view. And there are child soldier cases that, again, it's another area of the law where there's just results-oriented. There's child soldier case law that they could easily follow, to show that these people would be deserving of protection. But instead, because it's gangs and we don't want to, give protection to every single kid who's fleeing gang violence, we find a way to deny. By we, I mean the courts. Yeah. I don't have that power.
My question relates to kind of like the trajectory of the asylum seeker on their way to the United States. So because most of the people like that are coming are from Honduras, Guatemala, or like El Salvador, and then they presumably pass through Mexico, how much does it affect their chances of gaining asylum in the United States when they go through another country where they could presumably also seek asylum?
Yeah, so we have a bilateral treaty with Canada that's called the Safe Third Country, which basically means that if you come through the United States first, you can't apply for asylum in Canada, and vice versa. We don't have a bilateral treaty like that with Mexico, and Canada is actually fighting it. So under Bush, this is kind of a side point, but so under Bush, a team of lawyers in Canada actually litigated and said the United States shouldn't be considered a safe third country because it's so unsafe under Bush, sort of how people are being treated. And at the lower courts in Canada, they won, and then that got overturned. And they're actually litigating it again to show that the United States is not a safe third country. And it's at the very first stage right now. And I think we have a lot better case now than they did then. We're appearing as experts in that case. So something to watch out for. But so it doesn't impact their case that they didn't seek protection in Mexico, as long as they can show that they weren't firmly resettled in Mexico. So that's the real bar to asylum, is if it's not a bar to withholding or CAT, but it is a bar to asylum if you were firmly resettled in another country, which essentially means you had to have been given an offer of permanent status there. So Mexico is giving these travel visas. People, at the southern border, they have, I think, 30 days, you might know more from your research, it's 30 days, something like that, to travel through Mexico and then present. So people are getting these visas, or they're coming in undetected and traveling through. But most people, because they're really just come to the United States, they're not given any sort of offer of permanent status in Mexico. Yeah, and then there's still exceptions, like if you're, being persecuted in Mexico or conditions are so restrictive for you in Mexico, then you wouldn't be considered firmly resettled. So, yeah. And there's another complex legal thing that they're trying to do, which would essentially do the same thing, where people would actually have to wait in Mexico to have their claims heard here. They're trying to open detention centers in Mexico, but Mexican government so far has been like, no thank you. What are we getting back? I guess not having to pay for the wall you're building, or I don't know, but yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how SIJ fits into this framework.
Sure, yeah, so I'm not an expert in SIJ, so don't quote me on anything, but so I've done only one case, literally one. So special immigrant juvenile status here in the United States is for kids who are abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or both parents, or some states it has to be both parents, and they are eligible for this special visa here, which is a sort of a faster route to permanent resident status. And a lot of the kids who are applying for asylum do qualify for special immigrant juvenile status, and they might qualify for both. And you can, this SIJ is adjudicated outside of the immigration court system, not in the immigration court system. So it's kind of complicated procedurally how you would kind of pursue both of these remedies. But some kids choose not to do it because it severs your relationship with the non-abusive parent. So the kid would never be able to apply when they turn 21 for their non-abusive parent. But some of the kids choose to do it because it is kind of a sure route to a green card. But a lot of them, it's a best interest determination. So is it not in the best interest of the kid to send them back to the home country? And in most of these cases, given the conditions, it would not be considered best. But it involves state courts as well. They have to get an adjudication out of state court. So it's kind of Does that answer the question? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned both litigation, or at least a meeting at the Inter-American Commission and then also the litigation in Canada. Yeah. Are there other sort of either international or foreign legal options that you're pursuing or that kind of come up as potential for reining in this administration?
Yeah, there's that's a good question. I do think there's an organization called Asylum Access, and they do a lot of work in the United Nations, and they actually, I think they did something. It might have been, I think it was CEDAW, so the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and on sort of the disparate treatment of the courts in Ecuador for women's asylum claims. They've seen a lot of cases of sexual violence coming out of Colombia and had a really hard time getting those cases approved. But I don't think they've moved very far. So my understanding, and we can ask the experts at this end of the table how long things, I don't do a lot of work in the UN system, more with my Madre hat on, they do a lot of work, more work in some international systems. But that things take a while, to get processed. So I think that was a couple of years ago that they filed it. I don't think they've received any sort of action on it yet. But I think there are, that's another way, I guess, for your clients or so, to be able to have at least some sort of day in court or, but we haven't had the evidence yet really in the United States to show that there's sort of disparate treatment, akin to like some sort of equal protection claim or something. Enough yet. I think that there is some now. There's some recent data on, given the conditions for women in family detention centers, we're not detaining fathers with kids really at nearly at the same rate, things like that. So there probably are other avenues now. But yeah, I think otherwise the Inter-American Commission has been used a lot. There's been hearings on, I haven't been part of all of them, but there's, been a lot of hearings on what's happening sort of regionally in terms of migration and the need for some sort of, coordinated protection system. UNHCR has had several regional meetings, things like that. If you guys think of ideas, let us know.
I actually had a question, a little bit related in terms of sort of the international front, but you mentioned, for example, working with lawyers in Tijuana, and also working with organizations abroad to provide information on country conditions. And I'm just curious if there have been other ways in which you've worked with organizations or law enforcement or lawyers abroad in sort of tackling some of the asylum issues.
Yeah, we have some people from countries that are starting to see similar claims. So, in Tel Aviv, they were actually seeing a lot of kids' claims from Sudan and other countries in Africa. And then the Israeli asylum system was, basically denying all of these cases. So we were working kind of closely with them to develop some of the arguments. And sometimes we try to avoid, we really do not want to import the U.S. asylum system anywhere else. There are other things that we would, but this U.S. asylum system, the legal requirements and the evidentiary requirements have just become so crazy here. Other countries just do not demand the level of documentation that we do for asylum cases. So that's one thing where we're trying not to. But I haven't been involved very closely, but there have been a group of attorneys here who've been working with attorneys in Mexico, because Mexico has a new asylum system where they started training refugee officers last year because of this, problem of a lot of people being in Mexico and maybe not wanting to come to the United States anymore because it's dangerous or because they'll be put in detention, and then trying to seek asylum under Mexican law. So they have been working with some of the Mexican attorneys. The attorneys we've been working with in Tijuana have been more, they're actually, well, there's a mixture, but there's some American attorneys who spend time there, and then they work with people as they come across the border, and then they represent them in their cases in Los Angeles or in Southern California. So because of some of the problems I mentioned of how difficult it is to actually just get Border Patrol to listen to you and to get you, kind of shuttle you into the asylum system, that, historically you didn't need an attorney to help you at the border. You just went to the border and they sort of said, okay, you have a fear, you get put in the next, sort of next rung on the steps, but now you almost do. Yeah, kind of neat. So, and then we've appeared as amicus a few times in cases in Ecuador, as I mentioned, with asylum access, things like that. So it's been usually countries that are seeing similar kinds of cases that where their countries maybe don't recognize them yet. So, yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you again all for being here, and we'll look forward to more events next semester, which we'll let you know about. And thank you again, Blaine.
Yeah, have a nice holiday.
Thank you.